My name's Seamus Bovaird. I'm from Carrowhew, Greencastle. Reared in Shrove, Greencastle, all my life. Currently the chairman of the Maritime Museum, retired seafarer. Well, I went to sea first after I left college. That was 1962. But like most people around here, in your last years at school, I spent a couple of seasons fishing salmon during the summer. I spent a season relieving the boatmen on the pilot station, and then I joined a ship in Derry in tail end of 62. Small coaster. In those days, when the coasters were coming in, they would mention to the pilot on the way up the river, we've got a man going home, or there's a boy leaving in a week's time. Is there anybody about? And the pilots would have said, we've got somebody home on leave, or there's somebody I seen dodging around, or of a young fella that's anxious to get away. And it was as simple as that. You get word from the pilot to say, there's a berth on a Robertson boat next week, are you interested? And that you turned up and away. The community had a sort of a recruitment agency. Certain people around here would have had connections with a particular pilot, and say somebody that had been at sea for years, he came home to fish salmon or to go fishing, and if the fishing was tailing off, weather getting bad, he would go and see a particular pilot that they'd always been friendly with and say, codlin's disappearing off and need to be looking about going back. And the pilot would have that in the back of his head and join the two together. I had the option of being a school teacher like my father, or following my mother's side, and they were all at sea. So, I've been at it since Noah was in the cattle trade. Been away at sea for a couple, 200-300 years. A lot of them would have done their time at sea and then come back and been pilots on the Foyle, or originally out in Ballahary. Moved from Ballahary to Shrove as the pilot service moved. And most of my relations on her side, not all her relations, would have been at sea. Well, I would have been on the coast, as we call it, for about a year or so. And then I started going deep sea, which started you all over the world. And then after you get, what we call our sea time, and I went back to Belfast to the Tech and started doing my exams. Second mate first, and then more sea time, then back to do mates, then more sea time, and back to do masters, by which time it was the University of Ulster in Jordanstown. So I worked as an officer for the rest of my time. At the beginning, it was small tramp steamers, a couple of container ships. Containers were starting to come in, and tail end of the 60s, early 70s, and then I got a contract with BP and was on tankers for most of the time, and I ended up a few years after I was master, started being seconded on contract work, so I would have worked for the Portuguese government, training Portuguese officers on the handling of large ships. One thing about the Portuguese, you didn't have to teach them about seafaring. They were naturals, but they had no experience of super tankers. And then after that, I went to a German company with a contract for the development of oil tankers for the Venezuelan government. So I built 6 oil tankers in Korea, traded them from Venezuela up to the States whilst training Venezuelan officers to run them and take over from us. And then at that stage, I came ashore and I was manager of the Fisherman's Co-op, Foyle Fisherman's Co-op, until I eventually retired. It was a home job, and it had a seafaring element. The biggest part of it was marketing, but you still were dealing with boats, so it was sort of a natural progression, shall we say. By that stage, life at sea you were bogged in bureaucracy. The crew standards were dropping, paperwork was increasing, so it was definitely time to go. There's two co-ops in Greencastle. Greencastle Fisherman's Co-op was the first one, and it was set up primarily to break the stranglehold of Dublin markets. Fishermen had no control over their fish. They landed them in Greencastle. Some local buyers bought what they wanted. The rest went down to Dublin and were at the mercy of outside agencies. When the co-op was set up, the fishermen took a deliberate decision that they were going to put their money where their mouth was and take a loss here and there, take an increase in costs, but break the stranglehold of those markets. It took them a few years to do it, but they succeeded, and now Greencastle fish has gone all over Europe. The marketing issue was catching fish is one thing, getting the best price for it is what it's all about, otherwise you ain't going to make a profit. So when they broke the mould and started marketing and starting all that, the political side's totally different, and it hasn't really changed. There's only about 6,000-7,000 fishermen around the coast of Ireland. If they were all in one constituency, they couldn't elect a TD. So, I mean, they are dispersed, and I always complain about them that come election day, they're out fishing instead of voting, and the politicians know that. So, getting organised, there's several organisations around the coast. The co-ops are not primarily involved in lobbying. They have to. But the fishermen themselves have their own organisations. The Killybegs Fishermen's Organisation up here, the IFPO down south, south and east, south and west fishermen's organisations. They tend to do the lobbying, particularly the political lobbying. As when I was managing the co-op, I was part of an IBEC organisation about food production. Now that was real choice, all right. A lifelong trades unionist and Labour Party member working with IBEC, but that was part of the job. You had to do the Irish Food Council, and that was representing fish marketing. So I was with them for a while. We actually had the job of making a presentation to the European Parliament in one stage, and it was IBEC that did that for us. Got 3 of us from the fishing industry out to address the Parliament. Other than that, it would be more of a personal interest in history and social activism rather than from a representative of the fishing industry. Like I was involved in the community centre while I was at sea, and until for a good while after I came ashore, would still be involved only on the board of FLAG, which is a fishing related funding organisation, so there would have been a conflict of interest to have remained there. Well, with BIM, they were funding fishermen, and you would have been applying to them for grants for marketing, and also the fishermen dealt mostly with they would have dealt with their own applications for the whitefish fleet renewal and things like that. So you'd have been interacting with all departments in BAM, but not you weren't part of the system, you were just a client, but you got to know everybody. A lot of immigrants would have, from Inishowen and Donegal, Tyrone, they were sucked into this area by the trains. When the major immigrations were going on, you could get a train and then a skillen and end up in Derry, then a paddle steamer down to Moville. Same from over in Northern Ireland. Half of it came to Derry, the other half headed for Belfast. The Foyle was important purely because it was the most westerly point, and our immigration, the steamers, were not here primarily to take immigrants. They were here to collect the last mail from Europe before they went to America. If they hadn't had the mail contracts, they wouldn't have been coming into Moville. They came into Moville as opposed to Derry because they weren't going to waste 4 or 5 hours getting up and 4 or 5 hours coming down. They came in, dropped anchor, got the mails on board for Canada or wherever the contract was. Then, as an afterthought, take up these passengers and away you went. Before that, when McCorkles and Cooks were doing the earlier emigration and sailing ships, those were trading ships. They took immigrants out. They took a lot of commodities back from Canada and from the States. So there were trading vessels. Passengers were only one part of the trade. Now, they always say that when a lot of the Derry wooden ships were built in Canada with green timber, and green timber tends to contract and expand. And they brought grain and linseed and all back. As they started to leak and get older, they only brought timber back that wasn't affected by salt water. They still took paddies out, so obviously they weren't affected by salt water. I mean, those ships would have gone over to Canada, tried to collect the Canadian cargo homeward bound, but sometime there was far down as Mississippi to get cotton, to get grain. I don't know why, but flax was a big thing on this side, but the majority of the seed came from the States because their season seemed to crop and produce a better quantity of seed and don't know anything about the quality. So it was more economic to bring seed back to Derry from Canada or the northern states. Maybe it came in at the right time of the season. Plant it, harvest your flax, make your linen and send that back out to Canada But it was trade, not the people were an added the cream on top of the milk. Seafaring at the minute is a race to the bottom. The cheapest crew you can get is what they're putting on ships. So the Irishman or woman that needs a living wage cannot compete with people from Sierra Leone or Honduras or the Philippines or whatever. That's a fact of life. So you're only going to get a living on local ships or specialised ships. If you're an officer of any kind, once you've got experience, they'll all want you, but they do not have a system. So if you get an officer of the watch certificate, as they're called now, and you need a job as third mate, you'll be looking for too much money. Somebody else, Filipino, Chinese or whatever, somebody else is going to have that job. If you're an experienced chief officer or master, they want you and they'll pay good wages, but how they're not prepared to fill the gap. So people have to go to service industries, the oil industry, the offshore power industry, things like that, the ferries, survey ships, to get your time in. Then you can go on a wider market at a higher wage and better conditions. The opportunities are definitely getting fewer for ratings. That's definitely. For officers, they're getting fewer, but they're still available. Now, the fishery school trains fishermen up to a very good standard. The Irish system is very compartmentalised. In Canada, everybody goes to the same nautical college, for instance. So if you're going into the Canadian Navy to shoot off Exocet missiles, you spend your first year or 2 years in college with a fisherman who's going out to fish cod, or somebody else that's going to go on a ferry. The navigation, all the commonalities are dealt with at earlier stages, then you specialise. In Ireland, you go to Greencastle or down south for a fishing ticket. And then if you want to go into the Merchant Navy or the Irish Naval Service, you go to the National Maritime College of Ireland and ring a skiddy. And you come out with 3 different pieces of paper that are not interchangeable. You've done the same course. The world is still round. All that. The weather's still the weather. But if you come out with a Naval Service certificate or a fishing certificate or an STCW certificate for merchant, one won't recognise the other. So it limits some of the guys here that are fishing, that are moving into the offshore wind and offshore oil. They have to go and actually take a lesser certificate in the UK than they have for their fishing to get on board the boat, because they're not interchangeable. Well, if you've got 3 different systems, you've got 3 different sets of civil servants earning a wage. They don't speak to each other. Department of Agriculture's Fisheries and Food looks after fishing. Department of Transport looks after merchant seamen. The Department of Defence looks after the Naval Service. There was always ship owners who never carried apprentices. They expected somebody else to train them, and then they recruited them. So it's nothing new in the industry as such. You always had people like that didn't see it as a full progression. They just wanted to harvest, a bit like cuckoos. They want to harvest somebody else's crop. I mean, even in my time at sea, there was always a requirement for trained seafarers in shore industries. Like London would be the centre, was the centre for marine insurance, marine legal stuff, all that, consultancies. They all needed people with seagoing experience. So that is still a factor. There are the days of making a lifetime career of going to sea have been over for a long time. For a home perspective and all that. People don't want to do it, don't need to do it. You can, if you're getting trained, get a job ashore, engineering in particular. Like if you're a marine engineer running a ship, you've done a bit of everything. So if you come ashore to get a job with Irish Water in charge of a sewage treatment plant, it's the same pumps and pipe work on it. You've actually done it. There's a document out there about our oceans, government policy document about harvesting our ocean wealth and the blue planet, blue water. And in fairness, Ireland has 2 very good survey ships to go. They just recently committed to buy a third, to replace one. They're looking offshore. There's opportunities coming up in the future that for things that we don't even have yet to imagine. But the first ones would be offshore energy, wave energy, current energy, all that. We could probably power half of Europe with the waves that are running up against our coast. Marine leisure, marine tourism, ecotourism. There's a guy over in Ballycastle. He's a couple of rubs now. Started off with 1 rub. I think he's got 3 now. Taking people out to see seagulls and seals and cormorants around Rathlin Island because there's a colony in there. And he is making a living. So there are opportunities. They're not maximising them here because there's no incentive to do so. If you've got a tourism idea, provided you can drive to it, the government will support it, but don't ask them to come out of their comfort zone. We have regulations here that specifically preclude fishermen from taking people to sea. Other places, the boats are surveyed to both standards, they're built to both standards, and it's a simple email to say, I am taking 6 passengers out tomorrow, or I am leaving Glengad, call up Mallinhead Radio, say, leaving Glengad, 6 passengers on board, 2 crew, no fishing gear on board. Simple. If if the wind was behind it, all this could be done. It's been done elsewhere. Nobody's asking anybody to lower standards or reinvent the wheel. We're just asking for a bit of cooperation and a bit of common sense. I'm old enough to remember when the community was more joined up. Farmers shared horses because they could only afford to have one each. Fishermen were fishing using sails. If another one was there with an engine and saw the sail, he came and he towed them home. Small farmers fished salmon. They had their own boats. After the salmon was over, you had the regatta, which was traditionally in Greencastle, the 15th of August. Then the harvest was looming. Sometime during the harvest season, the codlin used to come into the back strand, as we called it. So farmers were out in the boat with the fish salmon in, with hand lines catching cod, which were salted and became part of their winter supplies. That element of the community knowing what was going on and being linked into the seasons has gone in a lot of cases. I mean, when I was at school, country schools got an extra 2 weeks at the teacher's discretion, so people could be adrift at particular times of harvest. That's all been years ago. That was pulled back in and became part of the general holidays, regardless of season. So we would have been able to leave primary school to rod corn for a farmer who needed a hand. Whether you rotted corn or not was a different matter. You got the holiday. Same with time to gather spuds. It was all worked into the system. So as school children, we were keeping an eye on how the spuds were, because we could see 3 days off school and a few bob coming from this. That was all gone. Fishermen, to a certain extent, would obviously have to retain that connection, because a lot of the fishing is seasonal. Different type of species of fish come and go. They mightn't be giving their neighbour a hand to pull a boat up over stones, but if an electronic sensor with the tail end of in front of a modern net fails, and somebody else has a spare one, that's swapped until the other one comes back. That's a gear. Somebody runs out of oil when they're out in the fishing ground because they have a leak in the hydraulics. They give somebody a shout that's nearby. You haven't got 20 litres of hydraulic oil that you could go and they'll come together and they'll swap. That still goes on. So the fishing side of the community still has that interaction. The rest of us tend to have it lost. The Royal Naval Reserve was something that was started way back in the 1850s. It was designed for professional seafarers to have a body of men who were already knowledgeable about the sea to tap into in the event of war. It went through various stages and functions, but around the turn of the century, there was various legislation changes. But say about 1900, you had a system where a fisherman in Greencastle could sign up in the Royal Naval Reserve. He would have gone to join up with the Coast Guard in Moville, who were still an entity here in Greencastle and Moville all around Ireland. And they would have drilled with them. They would have had their uniform and all that. And they would have learned to march up and down and do that sort of side of things. And then once a year or once every 2 years, they went to a depot ship or to a ship in reserve, and they actually went to sea in a battleship or a destroyer and saw how the practicalities of a military vessel would operate it. In Greencastle, well, all around on the show, it appears to be if you had an active Chief Coast Guard, you had an active RNR. In Greencastle, you'd have signed up and you would have got an annual stipend. It wasn't much, but it was money. It was cash. You would have gone then and you would have done your training and you're been taken to the UK eventually. Originally, they operated out of forts, coastal forts, and depot ships, which are ships that are tied up in a particular harbour and never move. So when World War I was declared, they had I can't remember the proper title, but like a false call-up practice. And then when the war was actually declared, almost all the RNR men all around the UK, British Isles, were ready to go. So they were all called up. They were sent off to the defence of Antwerp after it had been decided that Antwerp was going to be surrendered. They were buying time to keep the Belgians in the war until all the armies got behind proper defences, the canals in other words. So quite a few of the Greencastle ones ended up in Antwerp. Some of them then, very few of the Greencastle ones remained in the Royal Naval Division because their next adventure was Gallipoli, and that sort of wiped them out entirely. After that they were assimilated, and they were always called the Royal Naval Division right up to the end of the war, but they became a part of normal army. Now, they were never normal army because they always said port and starboard, ahead and astern. In other words, they decided, like, if we're here, we might as well take the piss out of the army officers. And, that was it. But they fought until the end of the war. Inishowen men were sent to sea. In other words, the time to get organised, and there was more ships. So none of them were retained in the Royal Naval Division, because most of our fellows would have been sailors as opposed to firemen and stokers. So they carried on and had normal service.